All the way back to the first modern amphibious landings in World War I, there had been an identified need to coordinate the efforts involved in getting the troops ashore, otherwise things had a habit of going horribly, horribly wrong. This was judged to be best done by a single vessel, which could hold all the command staff and the requisite communications equipment. At first, this tended to be a battleship, simply due to size and thus space, but soon amphibious landings were far larger than even a flagship-equipped battleship could handle, and so during and immediately after World War II, a fair number of specifically equipped vessels were commissioned. However, whilst a number of these were launched in this configuration, and others were converted from existing ships, all used merchant-grade hulls, and thus tended to not have a dramatically long lifespan, and were somewhat vulnerable to enemy attack, which was not something you particularly wanted when the entire command and communication staff are aboard said vessel. Operations in Korea showed that amphibious operations were not confined to World War II, and thus, as the older ships began to leave active service, work began on a new class of military-grade, dedicated amphibious command ships for the US Navy. These would become the Blue Ridge class. The basis for the new class would be the Iwo Jima class landing platform helicopters, or LPHs, which the new vessels would likely be supervising. With the basic hull widening to form a flight deck, for the various antennae for the ship's command, control and communication systems could be elevated a fair distance above the water, whilst also remaining spaced out to minimise interference. The flat nature of the deck also ensuring maximum coverage no matter the ship's orientation relative to the landing zone. Whilst the operation of helicopters would be a desirable feature, the ships would not need to run as many helicopters as the Iwo Jimas, nor run them as often, and so the side-mounted island could be dropped in favour of a more conventionally located bridge structure amidships, which also provided a mounting point for even more electronic systems. Unlike amphibious assault ships, which had to dedicate large amounts of space to troops and their equipment, aircraft carriers which had to devote most of their space to aircraft and facilities to support them, or surface combatants which needed to load up on weapons, the Blue Ridge class could dedicate a larger amount of their overall displacement to electronic equipment including computers, receivers, transmitters, and other more classified systems, as well as the space to support all the men who had to operate them and the command staff who needed to make all the decisions. The ships would displace just under 19,000 tons under normal conditions, with a single screw delivering the power plant's 22,000 shaft horsepower to get the vessels up to around 23 knots. For self-defense, some basic anti-aircraft weapons were fitted, initially a pair of twin 3-inch guns, later supplemented by a pair of Sea Sparrow launchers, with both subsequently replaced by Phalanx 20mm close-in weapon systems, and nowadays a few anti-surface 25mm cannon and some 50 cal machine guns, along with, of course, passive defense systems. There was also a Marine Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Team, just in case you wanted to get really up close and personal. Half a dozen ships were initially wanted, but as the need to organise large opposed landings appeared to recede, this was cut down to 3, and then down to 2, the USS Blue Ridge and the USS Mount Whitney. Laid down at the end of the 1960s and completed in remarkably quick time, commissioning at the very start of the 1970s, the ships emerged into a world where their initial purpose was now more and more being seen as a vanishingly remote circumstance, although some training exercises were still being undertaken. This might have left the ships and their vast electronic suites facing a quick and quiet career before being decommissioned. But, as it happened, with amphibious operations going on in the Vietnam War, the Blue Ridge found itself pretty much doing its design job after less than 2 years in commission, during which time, in between supervising landings, it developed an important role in other command, control and communication roles as a command ship in various naval exercises, conducting intel missions, and even disaster relief coordination. Subsequent events would also see her act as a transport, returning US prisoners of war and coordinating some of the final evacuations of Cambodia and South Vietnam, whilst evacuees, and in some cases helicopters, cascaded out of the sky onto the ship's flight deck. With such a wide-ranging field of operational expertise as the 1970s began to turn into the 1980s and many of the older cruiser flagships began to be decommissioned, Blue Ridge and her sister found a new natural home as fleet flagships, in Blue Ridge's case becoming the flagship of the 7th Fleet, which has seen her spend most of the last 4 decades in the Western Pacific, with a break in 1990 to lend her services as flagship for Operation Desert Storm. In her natural sailing waters, she also undertakes port visits, heads up exercises, and when needed has also continued in her role of supporting and coordinating disaster relief efforts, all roles for which her constantly updated electronic systems are well suited. In 2017, with the retirement of the USS Denver, Blue Ridge became the oldest active warship in the US Navy and thus earned the right to fly the first Navy Jack, something she's unlikely to give up anytime soon, as it's projected that she will remain in service for another couple of decades, which means she technically should be able to collect Social Security payments while still actively doing her job in a few years' time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.